Long in the family photo, Dad. You'll make it awkward. That was my daughter, my only child, standing in her wedding dress, not even looking me in the eye when she said it. I had driven 11 hours from Boise to Portland for that wedding. I'd taken 3 weeks off from the hardware store. I still run at 63 because I can't afford not to. I had a cashier's check for $30,000 in the inside pocket of my rented suit. Money I had spent 14 months saving, working Saturdays, skipping the knee surgery my doctor had been after me about since last spring. But apparently, I was going to make the photo awkward. I want to back up, because if I just tell you about that moment, you'll think my daughter is a monster. And for a long time, I didn't think she was. I thought she was just changed. I kept telling myself that. Changed by the new city, the new friends, the new life she'd built in Portland after she left Idaho at 22 and never really looked back. Her name is Vivian. She'll be 31 next March. When she was little, she used to climb into my truck before school, just to sit with me while I drank my coffee. We didn't even talk most mornings. She'd just lean against my arm and watch the sun come up over the ridge. I don't know when that person disappeared. I've spent a lot of nights trying to figure out the exact moment. I still haven't found it. Her mother, my ex-wife Patrice, left when Vivian was 9. It wasn't dramatic. There was no affair, no big blow-up. Patrice just decided one day that she wanted something else, something I couldn't give her, and she moved to Scottsdale and eventually remarried a man named Philip who sells commercial real estate and drives a white Mercedes. Vivian went to live with me. I raised her. I coached her soccer team. I sat in the parking lot of her high school at 2 in the morning when she had panic attacks before finals. I helped her move into 4 different apartments across 3 cities. I co-signed her first car loan. When she called me 2 years ago to tell me she'd met someone, a man named Theo whose family owns a chain of boutique hotels up and down the Pacific coast, I was genuinely happy for her. He seemed polite on FaceTime. He wore expensive shirts and talked about sustainable business practices. I thought, okay, this is good. She found someone who can give her stability. I just didn't realize that stability in their world came with an unspoken prerequisite. Everyone around you has to match the aesthetic. I noticed it at Thanksgiving, the first time I met Theo's parents in person. His mother, Beverly, looked at my hands when she shook them. Not my face. My hands, the kind of hands you get from 40 years of physical work, calloused, scarred at the knuckles, always a little rough no matter how much I washed them. She didn't say anything. She just smiled this very particular smile and turned to ask Vivian about the wedding venue. After dinner, Vivian pulled me aside in the kitchen and said, "Dad, I know Theo's family is a lot. Just try not to talk too much about the store, okay? They're not really, it's just not their world." I stood there with a dish towel in my hand, and I said, "Okay, sweetheart." I should have said something else. I know that now. The wedding was held at a vineyard outside Portland, the kind of place that charges $12,000 just for the venue rental on a Saturday. Vivian and Theo had put down a deposit. Theo's parents covered most of the catering and the band. The rehearsal dinner alone, at a waterfront restaurant downtown, cost more than my first truck. I arrived the day before and checked into a Holiday Inn on the highway because the inn where the rest of the family was staying was $340 a night, and I just couldn't do it. I didn't tell Vivian that. I told her the other place was fully booked. The morning of the wedding, I put on that rented suit, charcoal gray, which the rental place told me was the right choice for a vineyard ceremony in September, and I drove out to the property. The grounds were beautiful. I'll give them that. Rolling hills, rows of vines starting to turn gold, white chairs set up in a long arc, facing a cedar arch covered in flowers. I found Vivian in the bridal suite above the tasting room. She was almost fully ready. She looked stunning. Whatever else happened that day, she was the most beautiful I'd ever seen her, and I told her that. She smiled, hugged me. For about 30 seconds, it felt like everything was fine. Then Beverly knocked and came in with her daughter-in-law, Courtney, who was the maid of honor, and 2 women I didn't recognize who turned out to be Theo's cousins. The energy in the room shifted immediately. Not rudely, just shifted. I became background. I told Vivian I'd go find my seat and let her finish getting ready. She nodded without turning around. She was already looking at herself in the mirror with Beverly standing behind her, adjusting her veil. The ceremony was lovely. I sat in the front row on the left side, the bride's family side, because that's where I was supposed to sit. There were only 4 other people in that section. My sister Barbara and her husband Tom, who had driven up from Eugene, and 2 of Vivian's college friends who I'd met once before. Theo's side was full, cousins and aunts and business associates, and people I'd never heard of, all in linen and silk, all laughing and leaning toward each other like they'd known each other forever. When Vivian walked down the aisle, I stood up like every father does. I thought I might cry. I almost did. She looked at me once, briefly, and smiled. And then she looked at Theo, and she didn't look back. After the ceremony, while people were milling around with champagne glasses, a photographer gathered the families for formal portraits. Theo's family arranged themselves naturally, instinctively, the parents in the center, siblings fanning out, the younger generation kneeling in front. I walked over and stood at the edge, near Barbara, waiting. Vivian came over to me. I thought she was going to tell me where to stand. She said quietly, close to my ear, "Dad, I think it'll be easier if you just sit this one out. The photos will look more balanced without, it's a lot of people." I looked at her. I said, "I'm your father." She looked down at her bouquet. "I know, but Theo's family is they have a whole thing, a whole aesthetic. I just don't want it to be." She stopped. Then she said, "You understand, right?" I didn't understand. I still don't. I said, "Okay. Because what else do you say? You don't make a scene at your daughter's wedding. You just don't." So I stepped back. I walked over to a low stone wall near the edge of the vineyard, and I sat down and I watched a photographer take 45 minutes of portraits of my daughter with a family I'd never be part of. Barbara came and sat beside me about 10 minutes in. She didn't say anything. She just sat there. Tom brought me a glass of champagne I didn't touch. I was aware, very specifically, of the cashier's check in my inside pocket. $30,000. 14 months of Saturdays. I thought about the night Vivian was born during a February ice storm that shut down most of the roads in the Boise. Patrice went into labor at 11 p.m., and I drove 35 miles on black ice, white-knuckling that whole stretch of highway, talking out loud to myself just to stay focused. When the nurse put Vivian in my arms at 4 a.m., I sat in that chair by the hospital bed, and I made her a silent promise that I would never let anything hurt her. Not ever, not on my watch. I kept that promise for 31 years. I'm not sure she ever knew it. The reception was in the barrel room. Long wooden tables, candlelight, the smell of oak and wine. It was genuinely beautiful. I found my place card. I was at table 9, near the back, with Barbara and Tom and 2 colleagues of Theo's from the hotel business whom I'd never met. Nice enough people. We talked about the weather in Portland versus Idaho, the drive up, whether the salmon was local. Normal dinner party conversation with strangers. Vivian and Theo moved through the room doing their rounds. When they reached table 9, she hugged me and said I looked handsome. Theo shook my hand and thanked me for making the drive. He was perfectly pleasant. He always is. Perfectly, impenetrably pleasant, in a way that never lets you get close enough to say anything real. I ate the salmon. I drank 1 glass of wine. I listened to 3 toasts, 1 from Theo's best man, 1 from Courtney, 1 from Theo's father, who spoke for almost 12 minutes about legacy and family, and the long line of people who had built something worth passing down. Nobody asked me to speak. I had prepared something. 3 weeks before the wedding, I had sat at my kitchen table in Boise for 2 hours, and written out some things I wanted to say. About watching Vivian grow up. About the ice storm. About what it means to love someone and let them go. I had the folded paper in my shirt pocket under my suit jacket. I kept my hand on it during Theo's father's toast. Then Courtney sat back down and the DJ started playing, and that was that. Around 9 o'clock, I excused myself from table 9 and went to the restroom. I stood at the sink for a while looking at my hands. Beverly's reaction at Thanksgiving kept coming back to me. The way Vivian had said, "You understand, right?" at the portrait session Like being excluded from her wedding photos was a reasonable thing to simply understand. The 14 months of Saturdays. The knee I still hadn't fixed. I dried my hands. I reached into my inside jacket pocket. The cashier's check was made out to Vivian and Theodore. $30,000 in dark blue ink. I had driven to the bank 3 weeks ago and waited in line for 40 minutes to have it printed. I folded it once lengthwise, then again. Then I put it back in my pocket. I went back out to the reception. I stopped at the bar and got a glass of water, and I watched my daughter dance with her husband in the middle of that barrel room, laughing, her dress moving, completely at home in a life she had built very deliberately without me in it. I made a decision. I went back to table 9, said good night to Barbara and Tom, told them I had a long drive in the morning and needed to get some rest. Barbara looked at me with the kind of eyes that say they see everything and they're sorry and they don't know what to do. I hugged her. I shook Tom's hand. Then I walked to the gift table near the entrance of the barrel room. There was a white card box for envelopes, surrounded by wrapped presents. I had not brought a wrapped present. I reached into my pocket. I took out the cashier's check. I stood there with it in my hand for probably 30 seconds. Then I put it back in my pocket, turned around, and walked out of the vineyard. I sat in my truck in the parking lot for a while. Not crying, I was past that, just sitting. The music from the barrel room carried faintly through the walls. A country song I didn't recognize. The night was cold, the way September in Oregon gets cold. That damp chill that gets into your jacket no matter how warm it seems when you're moving. I called my sister before I pulled out. She picked up on the second ring, which meant she'd been watching her phone. I left, I said. I know, she said. I saw you go. I have the check. A pause. Good, she said. I drove back to the Holiday Inn. I lay on top of the bedspread in my suit, and I stared at the ceiling for a long time. I thought about calling Vivian. I thought about what I would say. I couldn't find the words, so I didn't call. The next morning, I drove 11 hours back to Boise. 3 days later, Vivian called me. She was still in Portland, back from a 2-night mini honeymoon at one of Theo's family's properties on the coast. Her voice had that careful, measured quality it gets when she's about to have a difficult conversation. I know that voice. I've known it since she was 15, and had to tell me she'd gotten a C in chemistry. She said the gift table had been light. She said several people had given cards with checks that hadn't fully covered their portion of the expenses, and she and Theo were trying to figure out the numbers. She said she wanted to know when I was planning to send my contribution. I let her finish. Then I said, Vivian. I was there. I drove 11 hours, and I sat at table 9, and I watched the portraits, and I stayed through dinner, and I wasn't asked to speak. I had a check for $30,000 in my pocket all night. Silence. I took it home with me. More silence. Then, very quietly, Dad. I'm not angry, I said. And I meant it. Or mostly meant it. But I need you to understand what happened at that vineyard. Not the version where everything was beautiful and I just happened to leave early. The real version. She said, I didn't think you'd actually. I know you didn't, I said. That's the part I want you to think about. I told her I loved her. That part was easy and true and will always be true. I told her that the door to my house in Boise is open whenever she wants to come back to it. I told her that if she ever wants to sit in a truck and watch the sun come up over the ridge like we used to, I'll make the coffee. Then I told her I needed some time, and I hung up. That money is still sitting in my savings account. I've thought about what to do with it. Barbara thinks I should take the trip to Alaska I've been talking about for 20 years. My buddy Leonard, who I've known since high school, says I should finally fix the knee. Maybe both. Maybe neither. Maybe it just sits there for a while and I let myself decide slowly. What I know is this. I spent 63 years building a life with my hands. I fixed things. I showed up. I drove on ice. That's not nothing. That's not something you get to erase from a photograph and call it more balanced. And I know something else now, something I couldn't have told you 2 months ago. Loving your child and accepting how they treat you are two completely different things. You can do one without doing the other. It took me 31 years and 11 hours in a rented suit to learn that. But I learned it. And I'm not going back to table 9. I keep coming back to that stone wall at the edge of the vineyard. The way the light was going gold over the rows of vines, and I was sitting there alone in a rented suit, watching my daughter take family portraits with people whose last name she'd had for about 45 minutes. That image doesn't leave you. I don't think it's supposed to. What I've had to sit with, and it took me a while to get here, is that what happened at that vineyard wasn't a single bad decision Vivian made. It was the end of a long chain of smaller ones. Every time I said, "Okay, sweetheart," when I should have said something true. Every time I made myself smaller so she wouldn't be uncomfortable. Every time I swallowed the real conversation because I didn't want to ruin something. Those moments added up. They always do. That's not blame. Not entirely hers, not entirely mine. It's just how these things actually work when you're honest about them. I think about the kind of man I tried to be raising her. I'm not perfect. I made mistakes. But I showed up. I drove on ice. I co-signed loans I couldn't really afford. I sat in parking lots at 2 in the morning. There's a word for that kind of commitment that people don't use much anymore. Integrity. Not the bumper sticker version. The real kind. Where you do the hard thing when nobody's watching and there's no reward waiting on the other side. I lived that way for 63 years because I believed it mattered. I still believe it. But I also had to accept, finally, that living with integrity doesn't protect you from being hurt by people you love. It just means you can look at yourself clearly afterward. The hardest part wasn't leaving the vineyard. It was the phone call 3 days later when Vivian asked about the money in that careful, measured voice. Because she genuinely didn't think I'd do it. She'd spent years learning from me, without me realizing it, that I would absorb the hurt and show up anyway. I had trained her to expect that. So, when I didn't, it wasn't just a surprise. It was information she didn't know how to process. That's the thing about finally holding your ground. It's not dramatic. It doesn't feel like victory. It feels like standing very still in a cold parking lot and understanding something you can't unknow. What I want, more than anything, is for Vivian to think clearly about what kind of person she wants to be, not what kind of life she wants to have. Those are different questions, and most people never figure out they're different. Wisdom isn't what you accumulate, it's what you're willing to examine. And the people who grow into something real, the ones who end up with lives that actually hold together, are the ones who can look at a moment like Table 9 and ask themselves hard questions instead of explaining it away. I don't know what she'll do with any of this. That part isn't mine to control. What I know is that $30,000 is sitting in my savings account in Boise. My knee still needs fixing. Barbara keeps sending me links to fishing lodges in Alaska. And for the first time in a long time, I'm making decisions based on what I actually think, not on what I'm afraid to lose. That's not nothing. At 63, after everything, that might be the most important thing I've ever kept.